All right, so should be able to go to today's content for today and go to the UV mapping. This is just what we're going to be doing in class. Go to the UV mapping. There's a UV mapping student file that you can then download, and should download that to your downloads folder. And from there you can extract that, and it should give you a little folder. And in that, so this is basically a project folder. In that project folder, there's a scene called UV Mapping Start, which is what we're going to be working out of today, and source images with some basic file textures that we'll look at, that we can work with to lay some images onto our surface. But before we do that, we'll talk a little bit about some other things. For today's assignment, for today's homework, in the Dropbox, we're going to be doing what's called a UV mapping macaroni and cheese box. And I'll show you what that looks like. So I have to pull this down. So when you look at that, you'll be able to see what's going on. So what I've done, hopefully this will be fun. What I've done is I've created a little scene that has a bowl of macaroni and a plate and a table and a background. And you're going to model a very simple macaroni and cheese box like I have right here. You're going to model that, and you're going to lay the UVs out so that the material, the object, so here's imagine our 3D object is just a simple, what would it be? How would you make a box like this? Right? Don't be afraid. Say it out loud. Confidence. A cube. Okay. Is it going to be just a plain old cube with nothing? You're just going to make a cube and just kind of shape it into or are you going to do anything else to it? Is it just a generic cube right out of the box? You're not going to do anything to the edges or anything? Might bevel the edges right a little bit so it has some roundness to it, so it catches the light, right? So you're going to create a very simple object. It's going to start out with, like everything, with the default material. You're going to add a new material to it. But what you're going to do then is take that object, and you're going to have to lay it out so that I'm going to give you a file map of this very thing right here. This is this box laid out flat. So you can think of UVs or UV mapping almost like creating a garment or clothing. So you know how your clothes is a 3D object, but it's really a bunch of seams and panels laid out. So you can actually take a shirt and lay it out flat, right? It's got a seam someplace. There's my seam. Here's a seam here. And there are a lot of just flat pieces. And so what we're going to be doing is taking apart the UVs, which is a new component on three-dimensional objects. So right now we've got vertices, right? Faces and edges. Those are the components that we've been working with. Now we're going to be working with another component of the three-dimensional model, of the polygon model, and that is what's called a UV. And so we're basically going to be cutting apart UV shells, separating them and laying them over. So the front box, the front face of the UVs would be laid over a certain portion. The side set of UVs would be laid over this portion. So we're really saying this piece of geometry is going to be associated with this part of a picture. Does that make sense? So we'll lay it out, and we'll really just lay it over an image that we have used. So this is kind of what it looks like in the end. And you're going to be downloading that project folder as well. I have it right here. Now don't get it confused. This is the study, and this is what you're going to be doing. All you're going to have to be responsible for is creating the macaroni box and putting the texture on it and setting it on the table and taking a picture of it, something like this. Does that make sense to everybody? Yep, this project folder will have the set already made up. The one we're doing in class is going to be just simple objects. Does that make sense? So right now we're going to be working with the project folder, or the project folder from week 5, just this demo. So you should have that in your downloads folder. You can work with it out of that if you want. Just make sure you know where it is. So inside of that, we have a scene called UV Mapping Start, and in the source images folder, and this is where all your image textures would be. This is where we have things like a baseball, billiard ball, and I talked a little bit about this last time, where I used this circular metal pattern as the grooves on a cymbal. I have some leather here and a grayscale leather image to act as a bump, and then something for wood. So these are just examples. And what you would want to do as you start to build your source images or your textures is what I recommend doing is start building your own images that you would keep in a folder that you can work out of. I got my own textures folder that I end up keeping things that I might want. So I might have some examples of concrete or something like that. And this is for down the road. Right now, we're just keeping things pretty simple. But as you go along, you'll be using textures like this a lot, and you'll want to go back to them. And usually I kind of start building my own library, so I can use these again and again and again. And it's not like I have to always start with something new. If I needed different examples of things that I might find interesting, stones, and you might look at different things like that. So it's something that you can start building, whether you take your own images or you get them off a website that allows you to download them. That's up to you, but something to kind of think about and to build up as you go along. Does that make sense? Does everybody have that first file downloaded and ready? So what we want to do is we're going to set our project to that. So we should have Maya up. These are things that we should already be able to do. And I'm going to say set project. And I'm going to go to, in this particular case, let me see. My student, now this had 2 folders inside of it. And then if I open this up, I should be able to go to the UV start. And hopefully when you get to this, you will find that there's just some very simple geometry here. Right, let's make sure everybody's in that spot, so make sure you have it. When you look at this scene, I have things over on the side. Everything's on a layer so that I can easily work with one individual object at a time. And you can see how that works. So this is everything's labeled. This is my ground plane. And so far, everything has the default Lambert on it. I've got my 2 lights set up just like we did before. This is kind of my default setup. Does that make sense to everybody? If you're having trouble with this, make sure you let us know. So Ryan can come around, we can help you so you don't get too far behind. All right. Now what we've done before already is we have learned to create procedural textures on something. So let's just go to the floor. Let's hide everything or make only the floor visible so we don't get distracted on things. And let's do what we normally do, or we already know how to do. We can assign an AI surface for the ground and apply a checker to it and apply a color that doesn't melt your eyes, okay? So how do we do that? We should everybody do it on your own. If you don't know how to do it, you really need to know how to do it today. We've done this, hopefully I do this so that we repeat this stuff over and over and over and over again. When I work, you start doing it automatically. It's just boom, everything's super, you get fast at it. I always kind of want to walk through the process. Make sure you're following along. I don't want you to be lost. I don't want you to be like, at the end of class going, I don't know what you're talking about? If you don't know what's going on, please ask now so we can get you set up. Does everybody know how to do that? Everybody's good? Let's see it. Go back to Windows and Settings and Preferences UI. Oh, UI elements. See the UI elements where? Go there and say status line. There's time. It might be. Go ahead and pause this. So again, 5 is shaded on the keypad. 6 is going to show you your texture. And right now, because we haven't modified this object at all, the UVs are intact. So the UVs, notice when you right-click on an object, we have all of this menu comes up, and we can see the different components: edges, vertex, vertex faces, faces. Then we have something called UV. And if we go over and click the UV, you're going to notice that it brings up little red dots, much like what we've seen in the past, only for vertices. But what these are for is helping us lay out in a component way, in a 2D way, where the material will fall on this surface. And the tool that we use for this is going to be called the UV Texture Editor. So I'm going to pull up, we're going to pull up another big menu, another big screen of things that is the UV Texture Editor. And I'm going to go up to UV in my main menu up here and go to UV Editor here. And when that comes up, it's going to give me a couple things. Should be able to see this UV Texture Editor. And you're going to see this grid that kind of looks like another screen with a grid. Remember way back when we began, the very first day, the modeling, these menu sets change the menu options here. So when things don't look like what I'm doing up on the screen, you do want to make sure you are following and checking to make sure you have the same things that we're working out of the same menu set. So this one isn't visible if you're using, say, rendering or something else. All right? So do make sure you're always aware. Remember, you can also pull up different menus and UI layouts over here. So we're under the modeling menu set. Is everybody able to see your UV texture editor, UV editor here and in this area? Can you see that? So what we have here is these UVs. We can go through and select them, and they'll correspond to the surface or the geometry over here. But what's interesting is, notice that underneath that, you can see the material or the texture that we've assigned. So you should be able to see, I can see you see a checkerboard. So make sure you can kind of see both. See how I have my object over here and my UV texture over here? Put them side by side so that you can kind of see what's going to happen here in a second. So I'm looking at this world, I'm looking at my scene from kind of a top view. So it's kind of confusing, but I'm looking at it so I can see where these grids are laid out. Okay? Everybody see that? If under here we've got a lot of different menus to work with. Right now I've got mine toned down, but if you are working with an image, you can use image dim, and you can dim it down a little bit so you can see your UVs and your edges a little bit. So right now we're going to be talking about a couple different things. And it can be kind of confusing because we're going to be looking at something that looks like vertices, right? They look like vertices, what we've already seen. But we're actually looking at UVs And they're in the same spots, essentially, as vertices, at least at the moment. We're also going to be talking about edges or seams. Seams are where the ends of the UV shells are. Notice there's a big white line around it. And this marks the outer perimeter of a shell. If you right-click inside of your UV editor, you can choose a shell, and a shell is an entire panel of UVs. Okay? Imagine this is a garment, right? This is a garment with one piece. It's a tablecloth or something. So it's not cut into small pieces. But if it was a shirt, like, it would have seams where the edges of those panels all lay out, right? Okay? In this particular case, it's saying, look, you've got a seam on the outer edge. So look what happens. So I'm going to choose a UV right up here, and I'm working in my UV editor. And I'm going to use the Move tool, just like I would the Transform tool, so I'm using the W key. And if I move that UV, notice, look at what I'm doing over here, but look at the result over here. I am actually moving the placement of where the color channels on my texture map are going to fall on my geometry. Notice how that purple line out swirling around on the right. If I was to grab a bunch of UVs and move them, it's going to move those color points on the surface. Remember, this is the surface of my geometry. I'm not moving the geometry, I'm moving the points on the geometry that correspond to the location of the colors on my image. If I use Scale tool and I scaled that down or scaled that up, notice how all of those vertices are basically saying, oh, okay, I'm covering a really large area. Notice that those checkers are small because I'm including all of these checkers within that UV space. Notice how it distorts because it's stretching all of those color values around these edges that are really getting pulled. And there's this distortion happening here and around here and down here. So we can get this image distortion. We can change the scale. So experiment with that a little bit. We're going to go back because we don't really want to mess these up because we want our image to look nice. But I want you to see the relationship between moving the UVs. So what I could do is, if I took this entire shell and I scaled it down, notice how that it makes the checkerboard look enormous. Now this checkerboard is actually repeating over and over and over and over again outside of this space. And if I made this large, I can make that checkerboard make that checker pattern be smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So the least amount of space that I'm covering, it can make it feel like this is the texture is really large or very small. Right now it's just 1-to-1. It takes that mesh and it lays it out in this entire space. So this is considered 0-1 space. 0-to-1, 0-to-1 and Y. So we're talking about a 2D object laying over a 3-dimensional object. Does that make sense to everybody? Now we can actually cut apart our mesh if we wanted to. So I could take this mesh and I could say go to an edge and I could choose an edge. Now let's say this is an edge right here. Let's say this is a seam. I could go up to cut and sew and say cut. And if I went to UV shells, I have 2 shells. And if I took that shell, I could move it. And if I took that shell and I rotated it, you could see that now those UVs are responding differently. So I've cut that. Even though this object hasn't been destroyed at all. It's the same. I'm just cutting apart its UV. I'm making smaller and smaller UV meshes or UV shells out of it. Does that make sense? Right now, I didn't mess with or destroy any of the UVs on this. And when they get destroyed, it's when we do things like beveling. So when the object starts to be changed and you're adding geometry to it, the default layout of your object is altered. So let's look at a just a generic cube. So go ahead and create a polygonal cube in our scene. Notice that when I select that, this cube shows up. I have my UV texture editor on. This is the default layout of the UVs. If I go into this and I look at the faces, there's that face. You can see where they illuminate as you go across, and you can see how the edges are illuminated. The edges of the mesh or of the UV map is illuminated here by those heavy white lines. And you can see how it's laid out in this T fashion, just like this. See the wings, the side panels, the front panel, and the three back panels, 1, 2, 3 inside. It's just like if you were laying out a box. Well, it is a box, right? It's like, how do you lay out a box in 3D? Well, you cut the sides right there, right there, right there, and you lay it out. And these are the edges. Does that make sense? Now, what we want to end up doing is, okay, when we are working with it and we don't change anything, like this hasn't been changed, but the minute we start to extrude and alter the object, I'm just going to do an all-over bevel on it, and it'll start to change. It'll start to change the geometry. Now look at my UV mesh. It's kind of screwed up. As I modify the geometry, the point is it gets messier and messier. Sometimes it isn't so bad. You know, sometimes the way it's laid out isn't so bad, but you can see how it begins to modify and change things. And what we have to do is go in and try to lay it out so that we can get the material where we want it. Okay? That's the basics of what we're trying to do. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, what we have to work with, because what we have to work with are some tools that Maya provides for us that are general ways to think about your object and your shapes. Okay? I'm not going to use this guy at the moment. I'm going to bring up go back to our channel box and go ahead and bring up the symbol. When we have an object like this, the symbol has UVs. Now, they already, the way I modeled it, I guess I did a good job. This is automatically, I didn't mess with these UVs at all. So this might get us by with what we're trying to do texture-wise. If I go in here, I'm in my UV editor. I'm going to go to my shells. I have a shell here. Here's my top shell. I'm going to hide my ground. Here's the bottom shell. And what do you think this is? Yeah, it's this edge right here. So there's this edge. So it's kind of, you know, luckily it's kind of worked in my favor. Now, one of the things we can do is, if we had to, we could do our own mapping. But if you don't have to, like in this particular case, I might get by with leaving it just like this. If there are areas or parts of your model that aren't going to be seen, you don't have to necessarily worry about laying out the UVs. You just want to give them a color or something like that. In this particular case, I'm going to want to lay these out. So what I want to do is I'm going to assign a material to this. I'm going to go back to my object. I'm going to assign a material, assign new material, Arnold AI surface. So here's my new shiny material, right? We're just working with basic things right now. What I would do is make it kind of a gold color. It's a symbol, so it's kind of a gold. If you guys are familiar with symbols, maybe yellow. You don't have to worry about that, really. So I have a gold color. But what I want to do is I want to lay over the top a map of some sort, an image that will replicate the grooves or maybe other things. But for now, I'm just going to lay over some images so I can see it. So what we've done in the past is we have gone in and mapped something, and we've gone to the 2D textures, and we've done something like checker or noise or something like that. What I want to do is use file. The file is going to open up a new, right? We have our 2D texture placement, but then it's feeding into this file node, and the file node wants to find an image of some sort. So there's a little folder here. So 2D placement is where it's going to be an X and Y. We worked with this last week, we worked with this last class. So I'm going to go to File 1, and I'll actually name that symbol image. And then I'm going to choose this little folder here, and it's going to go to my source images folder. And in that, I'm going to look at what's called a symbol bump, and I'm just going to use that image. So I'm going to choose symbol bump, and I'm going to say open. And when I select that, it's going to bring in that image of that symbol bump, which you can't see too well. So I'm going to undim it. You can see that image is here. You can see those concentric rings, but it's not laying on my object correctly, because my geometry here is kind of laid out in this space, like so. So this shell here is way up here. This shell here is way down there, and this shell is the inner ring. So this is actually getting the best part of the model. Does it make sense so far? Oh yeah, sure. Let me just back up. Okay, so let me just go back to where I am not. All right, so in my color channel, I'm going to say map a file. The file comes with its 2D placement node, which we're familiar with, and a file node. And in the file node attributes, file attributes, it needs to know what are you mapping, what's the file. So it's this little folder here. And that's automatically going to go to your source images folder because you have a project folder set up. And in the hierarchy of the project folder, source images is where we're going to put our texture maps, or our images. And because I've already got that image in there, I'm going to choose symbol bump. And I'm using it as a bump, but I'm using it as color right now so I can see it. Does that make sense? Because it's just gray, and I just want to know what I'm actually dealing with instead of rendering out a bump, because that would take forever. So I'll bring back up my UV texture editor, select my object, and so does that make sense to everybody? Oh, now it's not rendering on my image. Okay. Display, image, go back to my picture. Oh, did I actually connect it? All right. Has everybody got it there? Can you see it in your scene? Oh, did it dock? I hate it when it does that. All right. So what I want to do is I have my image. I want the image to come up here. Oh, I want to uncheck that. So I don't want these both checked. You can check checker box or image. I don't want both. If I check the checker, we can do this by just looking at the way a checker falls over the surface. Or I can use an image. So I want to just see the image. So what I want to do is I'm going to move these shells out of the way. So don't be afraid to just grab things and move them out of the way so you can work with it. So really all I'm going to do is place this in relation to the scene that I'm working with. So I want this hole over the symbol to go over this symbol here. go over this section here. And in general, I'm just going to kind of place it in that spot. Does that make sense? I'll scale it up. So really, I'm just putting that material over. I'm just basically moving that material so it looks like it's over that. Does that make sense to everybody? The larger I make this, the larger or smaller those concentric rings are going to look on my object. Does that make sense? Tori, are you all right? Everybody good? Give me a thumbs up. That makes sense? So I'm just going to, because I don't have any logos, I can really just move this shell and do the same thing. Because it's really the same top and bottom, I'm never going to be able to see the top and the bottom of this. So I could move this into position and do the same thing. And this is an area that I'm never really going to see. So I could just move that onto the symbol, into a symbol space as well. I could scale it down and put it up here someplace, or I could lay it out across. But the idea is I may not see that, so I could put it somewhere else. All right. Now I may have some issues with my texture, and I would want to just kind of keep working with that. Now, if this didn't work, so here's my symbol. I've got a little distortion there, but you can kind of see it's starting to come along. Does that make sense to everybody? And with textures, I can manipulate and move these edges or these UVs. So if I'm in my UV texture editor, I can go in, go to my object, and again, adjusting the shells when they're laid on top of one another. I may not want to do that, but I can grab regions and move them around. There's certain portions here that are a little bit overlapping. So there may be some tools that I can use to help kind of bring these out. So sometimes, oh, let's just take a break. Let me come around and see how everybody's doing with this. So sometimes these objects aren't quite right. The UVs aren't right because I didn't lay this UV out. Notice as I get close to here, I've got, and turn off your rendering because if it's like, it can slow things way down. There are issues right here. See this? Notice how there's a big error. So there's some issues with my geometry, and I want to find out what this edge is right here, if I can get a hold of it. And it may be here, it may be there. Oh, what it is this. So I've got this hole down here that I might need to modify or move in or work with. This hole right here. See this? This is kind of overlapping. So I could scale this down, and notice that when I do so, I can scale that down, and when I do that, it should make a difference on my surface, but I don't necessarily want to distort things, so I have to be careful. Notice there's some distortion going on. And it's offset too. I'm working in the wrong location. So when you work with these, when you work with UVs, it can take some time to kind of get right. When you work with UVs, I got to make sure I'm working with the right one for the most part, and then I'm working in the right area so that the material goes on straight, and then I don't distort it, but I have to manipulate it and work with it too. Sometimes it's easier to do it on a low poly or a lower poly version. So what I want to do is if I move these around, you can see how it can distort things. Now what I might want to do is try a different technique, try something a little different. So what happens is sometimes the mesh or the UVs aren't laid out properly when you are just modeling. So we have to do some different procedures to capture the UVs from the direction that we want. So let's try something different. All right, we're going to try a different method. Or were you able to get something relatively decent on there? Does that make sense for everybody? There are some tools that we can use to help kind of lay out and spread things out. Sometimes they can be helpful and sometimes they can not be helpful, but they typically can help lay things out a little bit. But before I do that, I want to see if I can maybe get a cleaner group of UVs. One way to do that is to take a projection, a UV projection from a specific axis. So because this is round and because it's relatively flat, I can take what's called a projection from the top in the Y. Or we can take a projection in the x-axis or in the z-axis. But basically what we want to do is look at this model from a planar point of view. Okay? And then what it'll end up doing is laying things out more directly like how you would see it from that point of view. So a box is very planar. You know, you have z, you have y, you have x. And you can get all of the different sides and of the faces of it from those three areas. Does that make sense? Thank you. So what I can do is, if we go back to our perspective view, we can go up to UV, and we can go to what's called a planar. These are mapping techniques, and I'm going to choose the options box here. The options box allows us to choose an axis to project from. If I project from the x-axis, it's going to shoot from the side, and I'll just be looking at it from the side. So it'll be like a cross-section of the symbol. If I do it from the z, it'll be the same. If I do it from the y, it'll be like looking down on it from the y-axis. And if I do that, I'm going to choose y. And if I say apply, notice that it creates this projection image in my user interface, and it's taking the entire object and it is looking at it from the very perfect orthographic Y view, and it is laying out the UVs of the entire object all in a row on top of one another. So all of the UVs, even though this is a three-dimensional object, they're all perfectly aligned from the Y. Everybody get that? Do you need me to repeat it? Does that make sense? So now I have a new set of UVs. And I can cut them apart again, or if I can get by with it, maybe I'll just leave it like this. Because in this particular case, the symbol might actually look better. Notice that the rings aren't distorted. All of these UVs, the entire shell, even though it's one giant shell, because everything is laid on top of one another perfectly, I can get away with just doing a perfect planar mapping. Does that make sense? Because the Y, positive Y and the negative Y are okay. And I can pretty well, I need to move it over just a little bit just to get that hole in the center. So if I did something like this, I'm just slightly moving it over, and I can use my arrow keys. Oh, not too much, but if you hold down Alt, no, I'm going to move it over just a tiny little bit. All right. So I'm going to center it something like so. And then my symbol here should look better when I render it out. Should look like the rings are in place and that everything is working quite nicely. Does that make sense? So when you're mapping, you usually have some processes that represent a sphere. So it'll take an object that's mostly like a sphere, and the parts that are mostly like a sphere, you will use what's called a spherical map. So let's look at that. I'm just going to show you the menus of it. You can get to it by going into Create. You can, in your UV editor or under UVs here, you can say under the different Create menu, we did planar. There's cylindrical. So if you have an object that is a cylinder, some sort of cylinder shape, or a portion of it is a cylinder, we'll use that. Spherical, in this particular case, is going to give you a spherical map. So let's look at how we would use those. Did everybody get the symbol to lay out properly? For the most part? Okay. Let's go ahead and deselect that. I'm going to go into object mode, deselect, and I'm going to go back and hide that symbol. We're done working with that. Let's bring up the cologne bottle. The cologne bottle has two parts. It has a cap that is a round surface, it's like a sphere, and a cylindrical surface, which is this neck part. So this is a good way, a way to try to lay these things out. If I was to right-click on it and choose UVs, and if I selected the UVs of it, oops, I can see where these UVs lie. And kind of just see where they're at. Now this, right now, this may or may not lay things out too well, but what we want to try to do is, as like we've done in the past, is get things laid out as flat as possible so that the mesh is seamless, if we can. But this has a seam, and everything's going to have a seam somewhere. And so what you want to end up doing is creating a seam where it will not be visible, or as least very, 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 you can hide it. So if I know I'm not going to be looking at the back of the bottle for my advertisement or my ad or my model, usually the back of the head, behind the ears, in the armpits, along the sides, the inner seams of legs, that sort of stuff is where you can hide seams. I'm going to assign a material to this like we've done in the past. Arnold surface. I'm going to call it, I'll call it the cap material. And like I say, always try to see if you can get by with your mapping on its own. If you can, great. So one of the quick ways to check is to simply use a checker map. And the checker map doesn't require you to assign, something to a color channel. It's a little checkbox here that you can bring up to lay out a checker pattern, and it has some letters on it too. And I'm going to scale it down just a little bit. So once I go beyond that boundaries, it starts to open up all these other little repetitive spaces. So I'm just going to keep it right in here. Notice that it has U and V spaces here, and you can see that it's laid out, and I can actually see those UVs corresponding to that object here. But the problem is I got a lot of stretching going on down in this region. And so this area has some problems. The checker doesn't match, right? So what I want to do is I want to find a way to lay that out. Now there's a nice seam right here, so it doesn't have to flow. This isn't like a garment or a tablecloth. So I could have a seam and it wouldn't matter. But what I want is to have this to be flat, more flat, and laid out. So what I can do is I can take these faces along this rim here. The inside of it doesn't really matter at this point because no one's ever going to see the inside of that. Well, they could, so we may want to fix that. So what I want to do is I want to create a cylindrical map. At least I'm going to try a cylindrical map to try to get a good layout of these materials. I'm see how it works. So I'm going to go to create, and I'm going to say cylindrical. I'm going to just go to my options box, make sure I reset everything, and I'm going to say apply. Now I'm looking in my workspace here. Notice how the UVs were laid out quite nicely already here. You can see there's an interactive piece here where I can scale this up or scale it down. You can kind of see it working. You can actually pull it around if you want, but typically I've got things in that space. I can pull it around if I want, but usually I have a pretty decent layout here. But what I want to do is, relatively speaking, I want to make sure these checkers down here match the checkers up here as far as just their scale and their scale overall scale to one another. Because right now this is really, really small. So I can go over and choose this shell, and I can scale this down until those checkers, and so that the shape is a checker, so that things are relatively proportionate to one another. So I'm looking up here and I'm looking down here to try to determine if what I've done is, so I may want to scale that up a little, and I'm kind of just estimating about how they match. Does that look about right? Can you see how I did that? This shell can be moved up out of the way. And this shell can be moved down together into that main space. Now here's a shell I'll have to work with, but for now these are the visual shells. All right, just one sec. Right, so I'm going to now, because this part of the object is more like a sphere, I'm going to go to an orthographic view so I can make this a little more clear. And I'm going to grab these faces like this and go back into my perspective view. I'm going to look around here. What I want to try to do is get maybe a more this might not be as good as what I've already got, but I want to show it to you anyway. See what we get. So I've got, since this is a sphere, I want to create spherical mapping. I'm going to go to my reset settings just to make sure, and I'm going to say apply. Now when I do that, it actually looks like it doesn't do a perfect job. I'm going to look at my map to see if it is distorted or not. Sometimes it can be kind of messy. I'm going to scale it down and look at it a little. So even though I may have to do some other work. So it's got a funky seam. No, the bottom edge is right. Is okay. I don't know. What do you think, Ryan? It's not so good, is it? I probably wouldn't use that. that didn't help me. I'm going to undo, just go back a little bit. Oh yeah, I shouldn't move it around too much. This gives me some issues across the top, but it's not totally awful. And so I may leave it like that for now. These points here all correspond to that center apex of it. So I might just leave it like that for now. It's not perfect, although there is some issues right there. You have a question, Tom?
Yeah, it was just because I noticed that one line was the one that was connected to all. Maybe that's why. Because like there's no other lines that are going down it.
All right, so I'm going to keep it kind of like that for now. Now, if we look at the bottle here, this bottle is kind of a mess because of all of the geometry that we have here. So this bottle is maybe more in line of several planars, or what's called automatic mapping, which may, look at all these edges. We don't want that necessarily. Yes, let's go ahead and assign a material to it. So I'm going to assign a material here, my Arnold surface. Oops, I guess I didn't do it. Assign a new material, Arnold AI standard surface. And I'll call this my bottle material.
Do you want us to assign this materials from your image sources?
No. All right. So let me back up. So I'm going to select these faces here to assign a material to. So I'm going to assign a material to this face. Right click, say assign a new material. And I can get this leather material. I'm going to give it a color. Then I want to select another section of faces to give that a new material. One way I could do that is to go into an orthographic view and just grab the faces that make up that portion as best I can. Another way to do that, which works as kind of a neat way, is to select basically like a ring, and hold down Shift and the greater than button. Hold down Shift, greater than, and it will start to add to that selection, slowly working its way up. So it's going to work its way up. I'm going to go into a wireframe so you can kind of see it. And if I go up one more, and there, so I get all of those faces wrapping around this geometry. Again, if I go hold down Shift and less than arrow, I can remove those faces all the way down, or go up until I get to that part. I don't want that part. I want everything up to there. So that's a neat way to select objects by growing the selection. Start with something that can grow equally in all directions. So I selected all 4 of these faces, and then it starts to grow that selection. Yes? I can go up to create in my UVs here. Oops, I'm going to go back in. Bring that back up. I'm going to select those again, just so that I have it. I'm going to go to create. And if I do what's called this automatic mapping, edit, reset, what this is going to do is it's going to look at this object from 6 different planes. Notice that it has 6 planes right here. That's going to be just like a cube, the front, top, back, sides, and it's going to try to lay out these UVs by projecting it out from these different areas. Now, what's going to happen is it's going to give me a bunch of shells that I'm probably going to have to reconnect together, possibly, but let's look and see what we get. Okay, so notice that you have all these different planes in our viewport. So there's 4 around it, and there's one from the top and one from the bottom. And it's going to create a bunch of shells for us that we can look at. So I'm going to go to my UV shell, go here and select shells. I'm going to try to anyway. Here we go. So here is the shell for the top. I'm just going to move these into the different parts. This is now separated out. So we'll have to do some reconstruction on these. And we'll have to find out, this is the back side. You can see how it's showing that there. So this is the front side. And this is the top. And I have some of these here that I'll work with in just a little bit. That's that bottom panel. We'll have to create our own from those down there. So this has broken it down into a few different panels here. So I do have some distinct edges here and along here too. Is everybody able to see that? So we can make sure that what we want to do is, as we look at these, are they kind of equal in size so that the spaces and the size of the checkers, notice that this side and this side look pretty good. So what I typically do is I will grab the ones I'm working with, these top portions. I will scale them down as a group to move them into this one space. Right now I'm not worried about these yet because I haven't mapped them. So I'll move them down into this one space like so. Okay? Is everybody able to do that? Now what I want to do is I want to see how is this laying out. I'm going to use these letters to try to orient how this is laying out. So the front of my object is in the Z, and I can move this around. If I want this to be the front and how this flows, I can move this and rotate this around so that I can kind of understand where it is in the flow of the mesh. So as it flows across this way, and I can see the edges here, here, here correspond with this mesh over here. So I can bring this mesh up and I can rotate it. You can see how it's a lot like moving panels of clothing around, where you have these different meshes kind of working together. Can you see how it kind of works? So I'm looking to see what edges correspond with what edges, and I'm going to move those close to one another and orient them so that the flow of the geometry kind of works. So here's that central seam. This edge or this vertex should correspond with this one. I'll check. Yeah, see how these two seams or these two vertices are the same? So if I can get this fairly close and fairly lined up so it's pretty close to one another, and if I don't mind that gap, and if it doesn't bother the overall flow of my geometry, then I could get by with that as it flows. Does that make sense? If I have to, I would have to seam those together if I wanted to, but I might get distortion. So I could say this edge and this edge, these two edges correspond to one another. I could sew them together. And then I get this flow across the geometry at that point. See how it's flowing across? But I can't always do that. I may be able to sew some of it together, so I have a little bit of flow. And what I mean by flow is look how it flows across. See how there's no edge here? Watch the color will flow across there without a distortion. See how it's distorting over here because there's an edge. Does that make sense? So I want to connect the garments or the shells as much as I can, but I can't always get every seam to line up. All right, just like my shirt line doesn't line up. There's a very evident gap. Okay? Same with down here. If I want to connect these two, what I can do is a quick way to do it is to say these edges go to move and sew. And boom, it just moves and sews them together. And I can see the flow of the geometry across those points. Now, I could try other methods to get a better flow. You might try doing it from the top and then cutting the seams in another way. All right? But what I want to try to do is, now if I tried to connect these, let's see what happens. Let's see what happens if I cut and sew those together. Let's see if I move those edges, does it distort anything? Can I get by with it? So here's my shell. I'm looking at these edges up here as I move across the U. And it does provide a little bit, but that might give me the ability. Now I have a seam here and a seam there, but this is a mess. So it may not always work. And there are some tools that I could use. So now I have a shell that moves all the way across and flows all the way, but I might have some issues somewhere. And there are some tools that I can use to try to relax the geometry, but sometimes that doesn't work too well. Does that make sense? So this, although it looks like one nice piece of geometry, might not work for all parts of it. Now, if I only look at that side, if I don't look at that side, it might be okay. There are some tools that you can use to unfold and to smooth your geometry. Sometimes that can help. Oh, I have to use my UV. If I go up to a tool and use unfold, and I can kind of, I can try to go over these things. If I say smooth, sometimes I can do something like that, and it will unfold my geometry and help it spread out. That was what's called the unfold tool. So I have my entire, go back, I have my entire UV mesh selected, and I can go to Tools, Unfold, and I get this little user interface that can sometimes help spread out those UVs in a way that might make them flow a little bit better. But some of the tools don't always work out the way you want to, but sometimes you can do it. Does that make sense? Now when I have that there like so, I'm working in UV space. If I went back to object mode and I go back to my leather material and I map something to the color channel, like a leather material, or go to my file and choose an image such as leather, and I could see how that looks and see if it flows over the surface. of my object. And I can see that that material then is flowing and it's not really looking too bad. And if I scale this up, it gets smaller. You can kind of see how now it flows over the surface like that. The larger the UVs are, the smaller it's going to look, but this is not a tileable image, so you can see those patches where it repeats. But actually, we might be able to fix that. If we go into our mirror options, it might actually work. Mirror U, mirror Y. Maybe not. No. I'll just scale that down. Does that make sense? I would do the same thing with the bottom half of my model and lay it out, do that automatic mapping, sew things together and lay it out so that the geometry flows around it. So this is one of the most challenging parts of models, is laying out those UVs so that the texture flows across the geometry the best way we can without any visible seams around it. Now this is a little bit more challenging, and the objects that you use for your project are typically going to be more square or round or cylindrical. We're not using a lot of organic shapes. We're using pretty much squares and boxes and cylinders and spheres. So these techniques should be adequate to get your objects to look the way that they should. For the assignment today, you're simply going to make the macaroni box and apply the texture to it. So you're going to have an image that has a macaroni box, which is exactly what this is. This is just a scan of the macaroni box. You're going to make a polygonal cube. You're going to capture the UVs, and you're going to arrange them over the image so that you create a macaroni and cheese box that then will go into the to the scene. So it'll look something like this. Everything in the scene is done except the macaroni and cheese box. All you need to do is make a box, UV map the packaging artwork over it, add it to your scene, something like this. This is a reference image for you to use. You can have 3 boxes, you can have more than one. If you do this and it makes sense and you want to create your own box and your own package and do your own little advertisement, you can, but just make sure you do this one first so that I make sure I can see what you're doing. Does that make sense? So that's what we're doing, and that'll be due when you come back on Monday. So this is just basic UV mapping. I'm going to look at from now to the end of the class. You can experiment with this and practice, but I'm going to be looking at your Project 2 concepts and talking with you about those so we can get those approved and so we can move forward on the modeling. Does that make sense to everybody? All right.